So what happens when a country decides to leave a massive political and economic union? And who gets to write the new rulebook? Well, that question gets a whole lot more complicated when the country leaving is itself a union of nations. Today, we are diving deep into a huge constitutional showdown between the UK and Scottish governments that went all the way to the Supreme Court.
All right, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the big problem Brexit created for places like Scotland. Then we'll get into Scotland's proposed solution and the massive legal fight it started. After that, we'll unpack what the Supreme Court actually decided, and finally, we'll explore what it all really means for the UK going forward.
And this whole thing really boils down to one single high-stakes question. Can a part of the UK, like Scotland, just go ahead and write its own rulebook for dealing with the fallout from Brexit?
Okay, so let's set the scene. How on earth did the decision to leave the EU create such a uniquely thorny, constitutional mess for Scotland and the other devolved nations?
It all comes down to this really important legal idea called legislative competence. Basically, it's just the power a parliament has to make laws. Think of it this way. The UK Parliament in Westminster is like a parent, and the Scottish Parliament is like a teenager. The parent sets the big house rules, like curfew. You can't touch those. Those are reserved matters. But the teenager has total freedom over their own room. Those are devolved matters. The problem with Brexit was, what happens when a rule that used to be set by a powerful neighbor, the EU, just vanishes? Who gets to decide the new rule? The parent or the teenager?
The timing is absolutely critical. So, after the 2016 Brexit vote, the UK government starts drafting its big EU withdrawal bill. Well, the Scottish Parliament sees this happening, gets worried its own power's on the line, and basically races to pass its own version in 2018, the Continuity Bill. And that right there set them on a collision course.
Okay, so here was the real heart of the problem. For decades, EU law had been tangled up in all these areas that were Scotland's responsibility. We're talking farming, fishing, environmental rules, you name it. The big fear in Edinburgh was, when the UK officially leaves, do all those rules just disappear? Poof? You'd have this giant legal black hole.
So, what was Scotland's big idea to fix this? Well, it was the Continuity Bill. You can really think of it as their attempt to build a kind of legal lifeboat, to make sure Scottish law didn't sink after Brexit.
The bill's #1 goal was pretty simple: stop the legal chaos. It planned to do this by basically hitting copy and paste on all the existing EU laws in their devolved areas and sticking them straight into Scottish law. But, and this is the really crucial part, it also wanted to give the Scottish Parliament the power to change those laws later on, even to keep up with new EU rules if they wanted to. Yeah, as you can probably guess, this pretty bold move from Scotland wasn't exactly going to fly under the radar in London. It almost immediately kicked off a direct, head-to-head constitutional conflict with the UK government.
Now, instead of just waiting for the bill to become law and then challenging it in court, the UK government did something pretty unusual. They took it directly to the Supreme Court before it could even get off the ground. They were essentially asking the top judges in the country to rule once and for all if Scotland had gone too far.
And this slide just lays out the disagreement perfectly. The UK government's argument was basically, hey, leaving the EU is foreign policy, that's our job. This Scottish bill is meddling with that. But on the other side, the Scottish government was saying, whoa, hold on, we're not talking about Brexit itself, we're just cleaning up the mess in our own backyard, like with environmental rules, which is absolutely our job to do.
So the battle lines are drawn, the arguments are made, and everything lands on the Supreme Court's desk. Let's get into how the judges tried to navigate this constitutional minefield.
And the verdict that came back was, well, it was really interesting, and honestly, it was kind of a surprise at first. The court looked at the very specific moment in time when the Scottish Parliament actually passed the bill. And they said, at that point, most of what the bill did was fine. It was within Scotland's powers. A big potential win for the Scottish government, right? But, and this is a huge but, there was a massive twist. In the time between Scotland passing its bill and the Supreme Court making its decision, the UK Parliament's own EU Withdrawal Act officially became law, and that new UK-wide law completely changed the rules of the game.
And you can see the court's thinking right here in this quote from the judgment. They said the UK's act was so important, it wasn't just another law, it was a fundamental constitutional statute. It didn't just work alongside Scotland's powers, it actually redefined them. It drew new lines in the sand for what Scotland was allowed to do.
And so, that was it. The final ruling came down. Even though the Scottish bill might have been perfectly legal today it was passed, the UK's new law effectively made key parts of it illegal after the fact.
The Supreme Court made it crystal clear. The UK Parliament's law was supreme, and it had basically cancelled out the Scottish one.
All right, so the Scottish Continuity Bill is basically dead in the water. But what about the bigger picture? What were the real-world consequences of this huge decision? Let's unpack the aftermath.
This whole thing really sent 4 super clear messages. First, it slammed the gavel down and reaffirmed that when push comes to shove, the UK Parliament is legally in charge. Second, it made it clear that devolved nations couldn't just go and forge their own separate paths on Brexit. Third, it really just threw a spotlight on the deep tension simmering at the heart of the UK. And finally, it set a massive precedent for any future fights like this.
So, why does all this matter? Because this case was never just about technical legal arguments. It was a clear, sharp answer from the highest court in the land to a really fundamental question. In today's United Kingdom, where does the ultimate power really lie? And the answer came back loud and clear, with the UK Parliament in Westminster. And that just leaves us with one final thought to chew on. The Supreme Court gave a very clear legal answer, no doubt about it. But by doing that, did it maybe just make the political question even deeper? The battle over the law might be over, but the debate over the future of the union itself, well, that may have just entered a whole new chapter.